The moment I saw the HOA president plant drugs in my son's boat at the lake, I knew our family was about to face the fight of our lives. But what they didn't know was that I owned the very sheriff's office that would soon be investigating their crimes. It started like any other Saturday morning at Eagle Point Lake. My 17-year-old son, Marcus, had taken his small fishing boat out at dawn, same routine he'd followed every weekend for the past 2 years. The kid was obsessed with bass fishing, dreaming of college scholarships, and maybe even going pro someday. That boat wasn't just his hobby, it was his future. I was sipping coffee on our dock around 8:30 when I noticed something odd. The HOA president was walking down the shoreline with a small bag in his hand. Now, Gerald wasn't the type to take morning strolls. This was a man who complained about everything from the color of our mailbox to the height of our grass. He lived for conflict, for control, for making everyone else's life miserable just because he could. Something in his movements seemed deliberate, calculated. He kept looking around, checking to see if anyone was watching. That's when my instincts kicked in. 25 years in business had taught me to recognize when someone was up to no good. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on him. What I saw next made my blood run cold. Gerald walked straight to Marcus's boat, which was tied up at the community dock. He climbed aboard without permission, moved toward the storage compartment near the back, and carefully placed something inside. Not dropped, not through, carefully placed. Like he was positioning it exactly where he wanted it found. My hand started shaking as the pieces clicked together. 3 weeks earlier, Gerald had threatened us during a heated HOA meeting. We'd been fighting their attempt to impose new docking fees that would essentially price out half the lake residents. Marcus had been there, defending our family's position with the kind of passion only a teenager could muster. "Your boy thinks he's some kind of big shot," Gerald had sneered after the meeting. "Maybe it's time someone taught your whole family some respect around here." Now, watching him plant evidence in my son's boat, those words took on a sinister new meaning. I grabbed my phone and started recording, but Gerald was already climbing out of the boat and walking away with that same smug expression he wore whenever he'd successfully ruined someone's day. My finger hovered over the call button. Who could I call? The local police? Half of them lived in HOA-controlled neighborhoods. Gerald had connections, influence, the kind of small-town power that could make problems disappear or create them where none existed. 20 minutes later, as if on cue, 2 patrol cars pulled into the lake parking area. I watched in horror as the officers approached Marcus, who had just returned from his fishing trip. My son's face went from confusion to shock to pure terror as they searched his boat and found exactly what Gerald had planted there. The baggie of what looked like marijuana was pulled from the storage compartment with dramatic flourish, as if this was some major drug bust instead of a 17-year-old kid being framed. "Marcus Thompson, you're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance," the lead officer announced loud enough for half the lake community to hear. As they cuffed my son, I saw Gerald watching from his lakeside deck, arms crossed, wearing the most satisfied smile I'd ever seen on another human being. He raised his coffee mug toward me in a mock toast, as if celebrating his victory over our family. That's when I realized Gerald Hutchinson had no idea who he was really dealing with. But he was about to find out. Let me tell you why this wasn't just another HOA dispute. This was personal warfare disguised as suburban politics. And Gerald had just crossed a line that would cost him everything he thought he controlled. For 3 years, I'd watched Gerald systematically destroy the peace of Eagle Point Lake. He'd moved here from the city with his retirement money and immediately decided that everyone else was doing lake life wrong. The man treated our HOA like his personal kingdom, issuing fines for everything from unauthorized dock decorations to excessive fishing noise. But his real target had always been families like ours, working-class people who'd saved for years to afford a modest lake house. Marcus wasn't just any 17-year-old. This kid had pulled himself up from rock bottom after his mother died when he was 14. I'd watched him channel his grief into something productive, something beautiful. Every morning at 5 a.m., he'd head out on that water, practicing his casting technique, studying fish patterns, teaching himself everything about competitive bass fishing. His bedroom walls were covered with tournament brackets and scholarship applications. Auburn, Alabama, Florida, every major fishing program knew his name. The boat Gerald had just planted drugs in wasn't some toy. Marcus had bought it with money earned from 2 part-time jobs: dishwasher at the lake restaurant and dock maintenance for elderly neighbors. 12 hours a week, every week for 2 years. He'd researched every component, saved every dollar, and assembled his floating classroom piece by piece. That boat represented discipline, dreams, and the kind of determination that should make any parent proud. But Gerald saw something different when he looked at my son. He saw defiance. He saw a kid who dared to speak up at HOA meetings instead of staying quiet and accepting whatever rules the adults imposed. 3 weeks ago, when Gerald proposed doubling the dock fees, Marcus had done his homework. He'd researched comparable lake communities, analyzed our HOA budget, and presented a detailed argument about why the increases were unnecessary and discriminatory. "Mr. Hutchinson," Marcus had said, standing up in that packed community center, "these fee increases would force out 12 families. That's not community building, that's class warfare." The room had erupted in applause. For the first time in years, someone had challenged Gerald's authority with facts instead of emotions. And Gerald's face had turned purple with rage. "You need to teach your boy some respect," he'd cornered me after the meeting. "Kids these days think they can mouth off to their betters without consequences." Their betters. That phrase told me everything I needed to know about Gerald's worldview. What Gerald didn't know, what nobody in our lake community knew, was the real scope of my business operations. To them, I was just Dave Thompson, the guy who owned a small commercial real estate company and kept to himself. They saw my modest lake house, my 10-year-old pickup truck, my quiet lifestyle, and assumed I was just another working-class neighbor trying to get by. They had no idea that Thompson Properties owned 17 commercial buildings across 3 counties. They didn't know about my industrial land holdings, my partnership in 2 construction companies, or my silent investment in the county's largest property management firm. Most importantly, they had no clue that I owned the building that housed the sheriff's department, along with their evidence storage facility and 3 patrol car maintenance contracts. I'd learned long ago that real power comes from staying invisible. Let the Gerald Hutchinsons of the world strut around demanding attention while you quietly build the infrastructure that actually makes decisions. The sheriff didn't work for me directly, but he sure as hell paid me rent every month, and his department's operating budget included several line items that traced back to my companies. But this wasn't about business leverage. This was about watching my son, who'd already lost his mother, who'd fought through depression and grief to build something meaningful, get handcuffed like a common criminal while his tormentors celebrated from across the water. Marcus had never even smoked a cigarette, let alone touched illegal drugs. The kid was obsessed with staying in tournament-eligible shape, following strict nutrition plans, training like a professional athlete. His drug test records from school sports programs could prove his innocence, but I knew how these things worked in small towns. Once the accusation was made, once the arrest was public, the damage to his reputation and his scholarship opportunities could be permanent. Gerald thought he was teaching us a lesson about respect and hierarchy. What he'd actually done was declare war on the wrong family. And unlike his previous victims, I had the resources to fight back in ways he couldn't imagine. The stakes weren't just my son's future anymore. This was about breaking a system of petty tyranny that had terrorized our entire community for too long. Gerald had finally picked on someone who could actually do something about it. 24 hours after watching my son get arrested on fabricated charges, I decided it was time to have a conversation with Gerald Hutchinson, one that would either end this nightmare or escalate it into something he wasn't prepared for. I found him exactly where I expected, holding court at the lake's community pavilion, surrounded by his usual group of enablers. These were the retirees who'd moved here with their pension money and immediately appointed themselves the moral guardians of everyone else's lifestyle. They hung on Gerald's every word like he was some kind of suburban prophet instead of a bitter old man with too much time and not enough real problems. "Well, well," Gerald announced loudly as I approached, making sure everyone could hear. "If it isn't the father of our local drug dealer, how's your boy enjoying county lockup, Dave?" The group chuckled like he'd made some clever joke. I felt my hands clench into fists, but 25 years of business negotiations had taught me to control my initial reactions. The man who loses his temper first usually loses everything else that matters. "We need to talk, Gerald. Privately." "Oh, I think our community deserves transparency about this situation," he replied, gesturing to his audience. "Your son was caught with illegal drugs in his boat. That's a matter of public safety, wouldn't you agree? You and I both know exactly how those drugs ended up in Marcus's boat." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Gerald's smile faltered for just a moment before returning, but now it had a sharper edge. "Are you suggesting I had something to do with your son's criminal behavior?" "Because that sounds dangerously close to slander, Dave, and in front of witnesses, no less." His supporters nodded approvingly, but I noticed something else. A few of them looked uncomfortable. These weren't evil people, just followers who'd gotten caught up in Gerald's cult of personality. But there's a difference between gossiping about property values and participating in a conspiracy to destroy a teenager's life. I'm suggesting that framing a 17-year-old kid for drug possession is a serious crime. I'm suggesting that whoever did it has no idea what kind of consequences they're about to face. Gerald stood up from his lawn chair, puffing out his chest like a rooster defending his territory. At 68, he was still a big man, probably 6'2", and carrying the kind of weight that comes from too many restaurant meals and not enough real work. He was used to intimidating people through sheer physical presence, combined with his HOA authority. "You want to talk consequences, Dave? Let's talk about them. Your boy's arrest is just the beginning. I've been documenting every HOA violation your family has committed over the past 3 years. Late doc fee payments, unauthorized modifications to your property line, excessive noise complaints from neighbors. By my count, you owe this community over $4,000 in accumulated fines." He pulled out a manila folder that looked suspiciously prepared, as if this confrontation had been planned. "And here's the beautiful thing about HOA covenants. They're legally binding. You signed them when you bought your little lake shack. That means I can put a line on your property for unpaid fines. I can make your life so financially complicated that you'll be begging to sell and move somewhere more. Appropriate for people in your situation." The threat was clear, and his audience was eating it up. This was the Gerald Hutchinson Show, at its finest, the powerful man putting the troublemaker in his place through legal intimidation and financial pressure. "You think you can come into our community and ignore our rules because you've got some kind of working-class chip on your shoulder," he continued, warming to his theme. "But this isn't the old days, Dave. This is a managed community with standards. Your boy needed to learn that lesson, and apparently, so do you." I let him finish his performance before responding. Sometimes the best strategy is letting your opponent reveal exactly how much rope they need to hang themselves. "Gerald, you just made 2 very serious mistakes. First, you essentially confessed to orchestrating my son's arrest as part of some personal vendetta. Second, You threatened to use fabricated HOA violations to steal my property. I didn't confess to anything. He backtracked quickly. And those violations are legitimate. Really? Because I have security cameras on my property that show exactly when and how those drugs got planted. I also have recordings of this conversation where you just connected Marcus's arrest to your campaign to force my family out of the community. The color drained from Gerald's face, but his arrogance wouldn't let him back down completely. Even if that were true, which it isn't, who's going to believe you? I've been a respected member of this community for years. I have connections with local law enforcement, relationships with county officials. You're nobody, Dave. You fix toilets in office buildings and live in the cheapest house on the lake. That's when I smiled for the first time since this conversation began. You know what, Gerald? You're absolutely right about one thing. I do have business relationships with county officials, more than you can possibly imagine. And you're about to find out exactly what those relationships mean. I turned to walk away, but Gerald couldn't resist getting the last word. Run home to your criminal son, Dave, and start packing. Because one way or another, your family's time at Eagle Point Lake is over. As I walked back to my truck, I was already making mental notes about everything Gerald had just said in front of witnesses. He'd connected Marcus's arrest to his harassment campaign, threatened property theft through fabricated violations, and essentially challenged me to a war he had no idea how to fight. The man thought he held all the cards because he controlled the HOA and had some minor political connections. But he was about to learn the difference between small-town influence and real power. And more importantly, he was about to discover that declaring war on the wrong family has consequences that go far beyond anything an HOA covenant could imagine. Over the next week, Gerald Hutchinson showed me exactly what small-town tyranny looks like when it's given free rein, and why so many good people just give up and move away instead of fighting back. The harassment campaign began immediately. On Monday morning, I woke up to find 3 separate HOA violation notices taped to my front door. Apparently, my mailbox was 2 inches too high, my dock had unauthorized decorative elements, and my grass exceeded the community height standards by what looked like maybe half an inch. Each violation carried a $50 fine and a demand for immediate compliance. But Gerald wasn't content with just targeting me. By Tuesday, every family who'd supported Marcus at that HOA meeting started receiving their own violation notices. The Hendersons got cited for their American flag being improperly displayed. The Johnsons were fined for having excessive outdoor furniture on their deck. Mrs. Patterson, an 80-year-old widow who'd lived at the lake for 15 years, received a notice claiming her flower garden was not in compliance with approved landscaping guidelines. This was collective punishment, pure and simple. Gerald was sending a message to the entire community: challenge his authority, and everyone suffers. Meanwhile, Marcus was stuck in a legal nightmare that seemed designed to drain our resources and break our spirit. The public defender assigned to his case was a 26-year-old kid, fresh out of law school, who seemed more interested in negotiating a plea deal than investigating the obvious frame-up. When I tried to explain about the security footage showing Gerald planting the drugs, the lawyer just shrugged. Look, Mr. Thompson, I understand you want to fight this, but the evidence is pretty clear-cut. Your son was caught with illegal substances in his possession. The DA's office is willing to offer a reduced sentence if Marcus pleads guilty to a misdemeanor charge. He'd get probation, community service, and it would stay off his permanent record. He's innocent, I insisted. This was a setup. That's what every parent says. But accusing a respected community leader of planting evidence? That's a serious allegation that would require serious proof. Do you have any witnesses to this alleged planting incident? That was the problem. Gerald had been careful. The only witness was me, and I was obviously biased. The security footage from my property showed Gerald walking toward the boat, but the angle wasn't perfect. A good lawyer could argue it wasn't conclusive. Even if we could prove misconduct, the public defender continued, your son would still need to explain how he didn't know there were drugs in his own boat. The jury's going to ask why he didn't discover them during his regular fishing routine. It was a trap with no clean way out. Fight the charges and risk a felony conviction that would destroy Marcus's future. Accept the plea deal and live with everyone believing my son was a drug user who'd gotten off easy. But the legal system wasn't Gerald's only weapon. By Wednesday, I discovered he'd been making phone calls to Marcus's potential sponsors. 3 companies that had been interested in supporting Marcus's tournament fishing career suddenly withdrew their offers. When I called to ask why, one sponsor was honest enough to tell me the truth. Look, Dave, we got a call from someone claiming to represent the Eagle Point Lake Community Association. He said your son had been arrested for drug possession and that sponsoring him would be a public relations nightmare. We can't afford to be associated with that kind of controversy. Gerald was systematically destroying not just Marcus's immediate legal situation, but his long-term prospects. Every scholarship opportunity, every sponsorship deal, every pathway to the future Marcus had worked so hard to build, it was all crumbling because of a lie that was becoming accepted truth through sheer repetition. The local newspaper ran a story about increased drug activity among Lake community youth, with Marcus's arrest as the primary example. They didn't mention that he'd never been in trouble before, that he was an honor student and accomplished athlete. They just presented him as another teenager who'd made bad choices and gotten caught. By Thursday, I realized Gerald had been planning this campaign for months. The violation notices were too detailed, too comprehensive. He'd been building files on every family he wanted to target, waiting for the right moment to deploy his arsenal. Marcus's frame-up wasn't just revenge for a single HOA meeting, it was the opening move in a larger plan to remake the entire lake community according to his vision. That evening, I got a call that made everything worse. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow with the non-compliant flower garden, had decided to sell her house and move in with her daughter rather than fight Gerald's harassment. She'd lived at Eagle Point Lake longer than anyone, had buried her husband in the local cemetery, had roots that went back decades. But at 80 years old, she didn't have the energy or resources for a legal battle against the HOA. I'm sorry, Dave, she said through tears. I know what that man did to Marcus is wrong, but I can't fight him anymore. These fines, these inspections, these constant letters, I just want some peace in whatever time I have left. That's when I understood the real scope of Gerald's evil. This wasn't just about power or control. He was using the HOA as a weapon to drive out anyone who couldn't or wouldn't submit to his authority. Mrs. Patterson was collateral damage in his war against my family, and he didn't care that he was destroying an innocent woman's final years. Friday morning brought the worst news yet. Marcus called from jail, and I could hear the defeat in his voice. Dad, maybe I should just take the plea deal. This is destroying you, destroying our neighbors. Maybe if I admit guilt, Gerald will leave everyone else alone. Son, you didn't do anything wrong. It doesn't matter anymore, does it? My reputation is ruined, my sponsors are gone, my college applications are worthless. Even if we prove I'm innocent, everyone will always wonder if I really was guilty. That phone call broke something inside me. Gerald hadn't just attacked my family, he'd broken my son's spirit, convinced him that justice was impossible and that surrender was the only option. But what Gerald didn't understand was that there's a difference between small-town influence and actual power. He controlled the HOA, had some political connections, and could manipulate local media. But all of that was about to become irrelevant because he'd finally pushed too far against someone who had resources he couldn't imagine. It was time to stop playing defense and show Gerald Hutchinson what real consequences looked like. That Friday night, after hearing my son ready to sacrifice himself to protect others, I made the decision that would change everything. It was time to stop hiding behind my quiet businessman persona and reveal exactly who Gerald had chosen to declare war against. My first call was to Sheriff Maria Santos. We'd known each other for 12 years, ever since her department had first leased the building I'd purchased specifically for law enforcement use. What started as a business relationship had evolved into genuine mutual respect. She was one of the few people who knew the real scope of my operations, and more importantly, she was someone who actually cared about justice over politics. "Dave, I was wondering when you'd call," she said, cutting straight to the point. "I've been watching this situation develop, and frankly, I'm not comfortable with how it's being handled. You know, Marcus didn't do this." "Of course, I know that. Your son's been drug tested 6 times in the past 2 years for school athletics. The kid's cleaner than a whistle. But I also know the evidence was found in his boat, and my officers followed proper procedure. My hands are somewhat tied unless we can prove how it got there. What if I told you I have video evidence of Gerald Hutchinson planting those drugs?" There was a long pause. "Then I'd say, we need to have a very serious conversation about evidence tampering and conspiracy charges. But Dave, the footage would need to be absolutely clear and indisputable." "It is, but there's a bigger problem. Gerald's been using the HOA to systematically harass anyone who opposes him. He's driving elderly residents out of their homes, destroying local families, and now he's escalated to framing teenagers for felonies. This isn't just about Marcus anymore. Bring me everything you have. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., my office." My next call was to Jonathan Pierce, the best criminal defense attorney in the state. We'd met years ago when I'd needed legal help with a complex property acquisition. Joan didn't come cheap, but he had a track record of destroying prosecutions built on fabricated evidence. "Dave, I heard about your son's situation. I was actually hoping you'd call. You know about Marcus? Word travels fast in legal circles, especially when it involves obvious frame jobs. I've already had 3 different lawyers contact me about similar HOA harassment cases in other counties. This Gerald character isn't operating in isolation. He's part of a larger pattern." That was news to me. "What kind of pattern?" "HOA presidents, with too much power and not enough oversight, using their position to target families they want gone. Usually it's about property values or personal vendettas, but planting drugs on a teenager? That's escalation to a level that demands serious consequences." "How serious?" "Federal conspiracy charges serious. If we can prove this was coordinated harassment designed to violate civil rights, we're talking about potential RICO prosecution. The FBI has a whole task force dedicated to HOA corruption cases." Sunday morning, I made my 3rd strategic call, this one to my business partner and oldest friend, Robert Chen. Rob owned the largest construction company in 3 counties and had government contracts that gave him access to information most people never see. "Rob, I need a favor. Full background check on Gerald Hutchinson, HOA president at Eagle Point Lake. Financial records, business connections, any legal troubles, everything. Give me 48 hours. But Dave, if you're going to war with this guy, make sure you're prepared for what you might find. In my experience, people who abuse small amounts of power usually have bigger skeletons they're hiding." By Monday morning, the counterattack was in full swing. Sheriff Santos reviewed my security footage with her forensics team and confirmed what I already knew. The evidence clearly showed Gerald planting something in Marcus's boat. But she also discovered something I hadn't noticed. "Dave, look at this timestamp. Gerald planted the evidence at 8:47 a.m. The anonymous tip that led to the search came in at 8:52 a.m., 5 minutes later. from a payphone that's been out of service for 6 months. Meaning? Meaning someone called it in from a cell phone but used caller ID spoofing to make it appear like a payphone call. That's premeditation, coordination, and probably involves multiple conspirators. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Jonathan Pierce arrived Tuesday with news that changed the entire scope of our legal strategy. He'd spent the weekend researching Gerald's background and discovered a pattern that went far beyond Eagle Point Lake. "Your HOA president has been busy," Joan announced, spreading files across my kitchen table. 3 other lake communities in neighboring counties. Same playbook. Move in, get elected to HOA leadership, then systematically drive out families who can't afford to fight extended legal battles. How is that legal? It isn't. But it's effective because most victims don't have the resources to fight back properly. Gerald's been basically running a real estate scam, create enough harassment to force below-market sales, then his associates buy the properties and flip them for profit. Associates? That's where it gets interesting. Your friend Gerald is connected to a property investment group that's been targeting lake communities across the region. They identify properties owned by working-class families, use HOA harassment to force sales, then gentrify the entire area for wealthy retirees. The final piece of the puzzle came Wednesday afternoon, when Rob Chen delivered his background report. What he discovered made Gerald's harassment campaign look like small-time criminal behavior compared to his actual activities. "Dave, your HOA president has been embezzling funds from multiple community associations for the past 8 years. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen maintenance fees, fraudulent vendor contracts, and kickback schemes. How much are we talking about? Conservative estimate? $700,000 across 4 different communities. And here's the beautiful part. He's been hiding the money in accounts linked to properties he doesn't legally own. Tax evasion, wire fraud, money laundering. The IRS would love to get their hands on this information. By Thursday morning, I had everything I needed to completely destroy Gerald's life and dismantle his entire operation. But more importantly, I had the evidence to clear Marcus and send a message that would prevent this from happening to other families." The irony wasn't lost on me. Gerald had spent weeks trying to use the legal system as a weapon against my family. Now I was about to show him what happens when someone with real resources decides to use that same system properly. He'd picked a fight with the wrong father, targeted the wrong community, and underestimated the wrong businessman. It was time to make the call that would end this war once and for all. The call I made that Thursday afternoon wasn't to Gerald Hutchinson, it was to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, and it set in motion the most satisfying 24 hours of my life. Agent Sarah Mitchell speaking. "Agent Mitchell, my name is Dave Thompson, and I have evidence of a multi-county HOA embezzlement and civil rights conspiracy that I believe falls under federal jurisdiction. Mr. Thompson, can you give me a brief overview of what you're alleging?" A coordinated scheme involving at least 4 lake communities, systematic harassment designed to force property sales, embezzlement of community funds totaling over $700,000, and the planting of illegal drugs on a minor to facilitate the conspiracy. There was a pause. "Mr. Thompson, I'm going to transfer you to our RICO task force. This sounds like something they need to hear immediately." By Friday morning, federal agents were conducting simultaneous raids on Gerald's home, his office, and the homes of 3 associates in neighboring counties. But I wanted Gerald to understand exactly who had brought his empire crashing down before he disappeared into the federal system. I found him at the community pavilion just like always, but this time he was alone. Word of the FBI raids had spread quickly, and his usual group of supporters had mysteriously found other places to be. Gerald was sitting at his picnic table, staring at his phone with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. "Hello, Gerald," He looked up, and for the first time since I'd known him, there was genuine fear in his eyes. "Dave, I suppose you've heard about this morning's misunderstanding." Misunderstanding? Is that what you're calling federal agents seizing your financial records and arresting your business partners? Look, if this is about your son, I'm sure we can work something out. Maybe the charges could be reconsidered. I sat down across from him, enjoying the role reversal. 2 weeks ago, he'd been the one in power, surrounded by supporters, confident in his ability to destroy my family. Now, he was isolated, desperate, and finally understanding what real consequences looked like. "Gerald, do you know what I do for a living?" You own some kind of property company, right? Fix office buildings or something?" "I own 17 commercial buildings across 3 counties, including the one that houses the sheriff's department. I have construction contracts with the county government worth $12 million annually. I own the property management company that maintains half the government buildings in this region." The color drained from his face as the implications sank in. "That sheriff's department you thought you had influence over? I built their evidence storage facility. Those county officials you claim to know? They've been paying me rent for the past decade. That legal system you tried to use as a weapon against my son? It operates in buildings I own, with budgets that include my contracts." I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know. Because you're a small-time bully who mistook community association politics for real power. You thought controlling a HOA made you important, when all it really made you was visible to people who could actually do something about your crimes?" Gerald tried to stand up, probably planning to walk away from this conversation, but I wasn't finished. "Sit down, Gerald. We're not done talking." Something in my voice made him comply. For the first time, he was getting a glimpse of the businessman who'd built a multi-million-dollar enterprise from nothing, and that businessman was not impressed with petty HOA tyrants. "Here's what's going to happen. The FBI has evidence of your embezzlement scheme across 4 counties. The IRS has your hidden financial accounts. The Justice Department has recordings of you threatening to steal people's property through fabricated HOA violations. And most importantly, they have crystal-clear video footage of you planting drugs in my son's boat. Dave, please, we can make a deal. I have money, property, connections. Your connections are worthless, and your property is about to be seized as evidence. But here's the thing that's really going to destroy you. It's not just the federal charges." I pulled out my phone and showed him a document that made his remaining color disappear completely. "This is a civil rights lawsuit being filed on behalf of every family you've harassed over the past 3 years. Mrs. Patterson, the Hendersons, the Johnsons, 12 other families whose lives you've made miserable for your own profit. The damages we're seeking total $2.3 million. I don't have that kind of money." "I know. But your property investment partners do, and they're about to discover that their business model of terrorizing working-class families has some very expensive legal consequences." Gerald put his head in his hands, finally understanding the scope of his destruction. But I wasn't done delivering justice. "There's one more thing you need to know, Gerald. Remember when you told me I was nobody? When you said I fixed toilets and lived in the cheapest house on the lake?" He nodded without looking up. "I chose to live modestly because I learned a long time ago that real power comes from being underestimated. You spent 3 years thinking you were the big shot around here, when the truth was, you were just a small-time crook who got too greedy and picked the wrong target. That's when Sheriff Santos arrived with 2 federal agents and enough evidence to ensure Gerald would spend the next decade in federal prison. Gerald Hutchinson, Agent Mitchell announced, you're under arrest for conspiracy, embezzlement, civil rights violations, and distribution of controlled substances. You have the right to remain silent." As they led him away in handcuffs, Gerald looked back at me with the expression of a man who finally understood how badly he'd miscalculated. He'd thought he was destroying my family, when all he'd really done was expose his own criminal empire to someone with the resources and connections to bring it all crashing down. The war was over, and Gerald had lost more completely than he'd ever imagined possible. You might think that watching Gerald Hutchinson get led away in handcuffs would be the end of this story, but corrupt people rarely go down without trying to take others with them, and Gerald's final desperate moves only made his destruction more complete. Within hours of his arrest, Gerald's lawyer, apparently paid for by his property investment partners, was already working the phones, trying to minimize the damage and shift blame. By Saturday morning, I received a call that showed just how deep this conspiracy really went. "Mr. Thompson, this is Rebecca Walsh from the county prosecutor's office. I understand your son was recently arrested on drug charges that may have been problematic." Problematic is one way to put it. Completely fabricated would be more accurate. Yes, well, we're prepared to drop all charges against your son immediately. In exchange, we'd appreciate your cooperation in keeping this situation as quiet as possible. Mr. Hutchinson made some poor decisions, but there's no need to destroy the reputations of other community leaders who may have been tangentially involved. The offer was clear. They wanted to sacrifice Gerald to protect whoever else was involved in this scheme. But I'd learned too much about how deep this corruption went to let anyone else walk away clean. "Mrs. Walsh, I appreciate the offer to drop charges against my innocent son, but I'm not interested in quiet resolutions. This conspiracy involved multiple counties, multiple HOAs, and systematic civil rights violations. The FBI is handling it now, and I intend to make sure every single person involved faces full consequences. Mr. Thompson, I think you should consider the broader implications of pursuing this aggressively. There are a lot of important people who could be embarrassed by an extended investigation. Important people like the county commissioners who approved Gerald's fraudulent vendor contracts, or the bank officials who helped him hide embezzled funds in shell company accounts, because the FBI already has all of that information." The line went quiet. Then I see. "Well, if you change your mind about a quieter resolution, please don't hesitate to call." That conversation told me everything I needed to know. Gerald's arrest wasn't the end of the corruption. It was the beginning of exposing a network that went much deeper than one power-mad HOA president. Monday brought Gerald's first attempt at retaliation from jail. His remaining associates launched a last-ditch effort to salvage their operation by targeting other families in the Lake community. 3 more residents received violation notices, and someone anonymously reported my property to the county health department, claiming I was operating an illegal business from my home. But Gerald had forgotten something crucial. He no longer controlled the narrative, and I wasn't some isolated victim he could quietly destroy. When the county health inspector arrived Tuesday morning, he was accompanied by Agent Mitchell and 2 IRS investigators who were very interested in learning more about Gerald's network of county connections. "Mr. Thompson," the health inspector said nervously, "I received a complaint about possible code violations on your property, but frankly, after reviewing the file, I'm not sure why this was escalated to my department. Probably because someone wanted to harass me for cooperating with a federal investigation," I suggested. Agent Mitchell stepped forward. "Actually, we're very interested in learning who filed this complaint and whether it's connected to the conspiracy charges we're prosecuting. Would you be willing to provide us with a documentation trail?" Watching the inspector realize he'd been used as a weapon in a criminal conspiracy was almost as satisfying as Gerald's arrest. Within an hour, we had the name of the person who'd filed the false complaint, one of Gerald's business partners who was apparently too stupid to understand that federal agents were monitoring all activities related to their investigation. By Wednesday, Gerald's entire network was in collapse. 2 more arrests were made, 3 county officials resigned to spend time with family, and the property investment group dissolved amid IRS seizures and federal fraud charges. But Gerald wasn't finished trying to hurt people from his jail cell. Thursday morning brought his most desperate move, yet a completely fabricated story leaked to regional media claiming that I was the real criminal, using my business connections to frame innocent community leaders. The story lasted exactly 4 hours before it was retracted. Turns out that investigative journalists don't appreciate being used to spread lies, especially when federal agents can provide them with actual evidence that contradicts every claim. "Mr. Thompson," the reporter called to apologize, "I want you to know that we're now investigating how Mr. Hutchinson was able to plant this false story and who helped him do it from jail. This appears to be witness intimidation, which adds another federal charge to his case." By Friday, the final piece of Gerald's retaliation attempt crumbled when his remaining supporters in the Lake community tried to call an emergency HOA meeting to somehow undo the investigation. They managed to get exactly 3 people to show up, including Mrs. Patterson, who had some things to say about Gerald's harassment campaign. "I have lived at this lake for 15 years, she announced to the nearly empty room. "I buried my husband here, raised my grandchildren here, and plan to spend my final years here in peace. Gerald Hutchinson tried to steal that from me through lies and intimidation. I want everyone to know that Dave Thompson and his family are heroes for stopping a criminal who was destroying our community." The meeting lasted exactly 12 minutes before being adjourned for lack of attendance. Gerald's power base had completely evaporated, and even his most loyal supporters were now running for cover. But the most satisfying moment came Saturday evening when Marcus called me from the county jail where he was visiting Gerald Hutchinson. "Dad, you're not going to believe this. Gerald asked to see me. He wanted to apologize." "What did you say to him?" "I told him that his apology didn't matter to me, but it might matter to Mrs. Patterson and all the other people he hurt. Then I told him that trying to destroy teenagers to cover up his crimes was the act of a coward, and that he was going to have a very long time in federal prison to think about the kind of man he chose to be." Gerald's final retaliation attempts hadn't just failed, they'd made his legal situation worse and turned his last few supporters against him. The man who'd once controlled an entire lake community through fear and intimidation was now a federal prisoner whose own lawyer was advising him to plead guilty to avoid even harsher sentences. Justice wasn't just served, it was delivered with compound interest. 6 months later, as I watched Marcus cast his line into Eagle Point Lake at sunrise, I realized that sometimes the most important victories aren't the ones that make headlines, they're the ones that restore a family's faith in justice and a community's ability to heal. Marcus had been completely exonerated, with all charges dropped and his record expunged. But more importantly, his spirit had been restored. The scholarship offers came flooding back once the truth became public, and 3 new sponsors reached out specifically because they admired how our family had fought back against corruption. Auburn University didn't just renew their interest, they increased their offer and invited Marcus to speak at their freshman orientation about standing up for what's right. "You know what the best part is, Dad?" Marcus said as he adjusted his fishing rod. "It's not that we won. It's that we proved that bullies like Gerald only have the power we give them." The lake community had transformed completely. Gerald's arrest had exposed HOA violations that were either fabricated or selectively enforced, resulting in thousands of dollars in refunded fines for residents who'd been targeted. Mrs. Patterson not only got to stay in her home, she was elected as the new HOA treasurer, bringing decades of genuine community experience to leadership. The federal investigation had expanded far beyond Gerald, ultimately resulting in 14 arrests across 4 counties. The property investment scheme was dismantled, with seized assets used to compensate families who'd been forced to sell their homes under duress. 3 county officials were convicted of corruption charges, and new oversight procedures were implemented to prevent HOA abuse. But the personal healing was what mattered most to me. The phone call from Marcus's college counselor still gives me chills when I think about it. "Mr. Thompson, I wanted you to know that Marcus's application essay about fighting injustice and supporting his community has been selected for our Dean's Award. But more than that, his character and resilience have impressed every admissions officer who's met him. Your son isn't just going to college, he's going to change the world." Gerald Hutchinson was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy, embezzlement, and civil rights violations. His property was seized, his associates were either imprisoned or fled the state, and his name became a cautionary tale about what happens when petty tyrants mistake temporary authority for real power. The civil lawsuit resulted in a $1.8 million settlement that was distributed among the families Gerald had harassed. Mrs. Patterson used her portion to establish a legal defense fund for Lake residents facing HOA abuse. The Hendersons expanded their small business. 3 families were able to buy back properties they'd been forced to sell below market value. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome was learning what happened to Gerald in prison. According to his former cellmate, who was released last month, Gerald spent most of his time trying to convince other inmates that he was the victim of a vast conspiracy orchestrated by wealthy property developers. The old man couldn't understand why nobody believed him, the former cellmate told a local reporter. He kept saying he was just trying to maintain community standards, and everyone was like, "Dude, you planted drugs on a kid. Nobody cares about your community standards." 6 months of federal investigation taught me something I hadn't expected. Gerald wasn't unique. Across the country, HOA boards are being infiltrated by people who see community associations as opportunities for profit, power, and personal vendettas. What made our situation different was that Gerald picked a target who had the resources and connections to fight back effectively. That's the real lesson here, and it's why I'm telling this story. Bullies like Gerald count on their victims being isolated, overwhelmed, and unable to match their resources or political connections. They use legitimate-sounding organizations like HOAs to mask criminal behavior behind community welfare rhetoric. And they succeed because most people don't have the time, money, or knowledge to fight back properly. But here's what Gerald didn't understand, and what every bully needs to learn: real power isn't about controlling other people through fear and intimidation. Real power is about building something meaningful, helping your community, and standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves. I didn't reveal my business connections to intimidate anyone or show off my wealth. I used them because my son's future was at stake, my community was being terrorized, and someone needed to prove that justice still matters more than politics. The morning Marcus left for college, he hugged me on our dock and said something that made everything we'd gone through worthwhile. "Dad, I used to think the world was divided between people with power and people without it. But you taught me that it's really divided between people who use their power to help others and people who use it to hurt them. I want to spend my life being the first kind. That's the legacy I want to leave, not the businessman who owned buildings or won legal battles, but the father who taught his son that fighting for what's right is always worth the cost." If you're facing your own Gerald Hutchinson, if someone is using their position to terrorize your family or community, don't give up and don't give in. Document everything, find allies, and remember that bullies only win when good people decide the fight isn't worth it. And if this story resonated with you, if you've seen corruption in your own community or want to help others fight back against abuse of power, hit that subscribe button and share this story. Sometimes the most important battles happen in small towns and suburban neighborhoods, and they need voices to make sure justice isn't just for people with resources. The Gerald Hutchinsons of the world are counting on our silence. It's time to prove them wrong.